This program is brought to you by Resonance 104.4 FM. If you like what you hear and want to support our work, please make a donation at fundraiser.resonance.fm.
All I'm doing is letting myself totally go. I don't care about you. I don't want to please you. I don't want to be something special. All I want to be is in that total feeling. Just be totally into it. And even if you think it's ridiculous, that's your problem. I enjoy tremendously Resonance Radio. Resonance Radio. Radio plays.
Resonance. This is Resonance.
Hello, this is the News Agents. I'm Jude Cowan Montague, and I'm delighted to welcome refugees actually today, because it is the Welcome Refugees March across London. And I've got here in front of me a poster that's been brought in my very welcome guest, George Szirtes, the poet, and it's the Amnesty International bright yellow poster, I Welcome Refugees, and on the other side, Refugees Welcome, on a black background. Very striking and very strong, and that's our message today, I guess. Hello, George, and welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
We're just going to start with a little track, I think, to give us a little time to settle into the show.
Them from the desert, using their tracks. They leave marks or tracks, and we follow their trail. To know whether the snakes are poisonous or not. We hunt them from the desert, using their tracks. They leave marks or tracks, and we follow their trail. I use my experience to know whether the snakes are poisonous or not, and what type they are. Through the trail they leave behind. 36 types of snakes in Egypt. 7 are poisonous, 29 are non-poisonous. This is the song of the zookeeper. This is the song of the zookeeper who respects animals, who respects animals. Who respects animals? making a hissing noise at the wildcat. The cat hisses back. Number one caretakers of animals around the world.
So that's actually the title track from my forthcoming album, Number One Caretaker of Animals Around the World, and it is an interpretation of done live in the studio about a Reuters news story about a zoo, a strange small zoo in Egypt, in Giza, and a guy kind of running a little family zoo just off his own bat. It was kind of domestic zoo, and it had things like he'd found snakes sort of locally, and he'd got them there, and he was showing them to the kids to hold, and squirrels and things. A really, really good kind of small-scale education with what you have, and looking after the animals at the same time, I thought. Yeah. So back to the studio today, and hello, George Szirtes again, our guest today.
Hello there.
Hi, and you have come from the march.
I came from the march. I came down from Norfolk this morning and got to the march just at the top at Marble Arch, and then it actually begins quite a long way down Park Lane, and so down towards Hyde Park Square and all the way to Parliament Square.
And the title of the march,
the title of the march is Welcome Refugees.
Welcome Refugees. And is it Amnesty that's been organising?
Oh, it's lots of different people. There's so many different groups there, it's quite hard to count, actually. I think Amnesty is fairly major, but Oxfam is there, various parties, the usual ones you'd expect, so there's a bit of everyone.
Yeah, and if people want to rush out now, or you're passing Hyde Park, you can go and swell the numbers. And
well, that's right. They'll be on their way to Parliament Square. They're sort of trundling along as marches generally do, quite slowly, but with a bit of music.
Yeah, the music is always great for movement. And it was important to you to join the march, even though you had the radio show booked in today, because you are a refugee yourself.
Yes, I was a refugee in 1956.
Yeah.
I was one of the 1956 Hungarian uprising refugees, and about some 28,000 of us came to England. I was just a kid, I should say. I was just only just 8 years old. But yes, so, I mean, there's a personal stake in this too. Yeah,
and you must remember that, because 8 years old is an age at which we've got memories of what happens around us, perhaps not the same type of memories as we get later on, but...
Yes, I think memory is not so much like a feature film, it's more like YouTube clips, and they're broken. But I've got little bits of YouTube clips quite clearly in my mind. I remember crossing the border, this was about 2:00 in the morning, from Hungary into Austria on foot, with a party of about, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 18 other people, being guarded across by they were probably farm labourers, and stumbling up on a copse of trees where a man in uniform appeared, and he wasn't Hungarian, he was Austrian. So they were kind of waiting for us because loads of people were leaving.
And as a child, you would know that it was strange things were happening, important things in your life, but you wouldn't be aware of what. So it must be quite an unusual thing for a young person to assimilate and carry inside them afterwards. Must internalise the journey. Well, things
change over years. At the time, I don't think I knew very much about it. Both my brother and I had been in quarantine with scarlet fever. We just kind of recovered when all this happened. And I knew there was firing outside. And at one point you had to change addresses, and then there were bodies in the streets. So you do see all of that, but you don't know what it's about. And the actual crossing of the border, when people say, was it scary? I said, well, no, it was quite exciting, really. You're out at 2:00 in the morning, and everybody's walking across a field, and you have no idea of the dangers.
No, you certainly don't. The borders of Hungary are now a very contested place as well, aren't they? Due to the enlargement of the EU, and then people trying to get in the EU, and then people trying to keep people out of the EU. There's these fences and borders now and crossings.
Well, I was there the previous summer while the refugees, migrants, Depends which side you are of this and what you call them.
Yeah.
They look certainly like refugees to me. They were all being gathered at one of the major rail terminals in Budapest, so they were sleeping rough. Young families on the whole, quite a lot of little children. And they were detained there for a while. They were hoping to get on a train into Austria and then continue.
Yeah.
The fence went up since then.
Because I've been reading a couple of stories from the recent news agency stories where journalists and local people have been at the fences and have just been reporting on the migrant, the population that's settled around the fences and they're trying to get across and how they're organising themselves. And it's just been... I think it's important sometimes to read stories like that because it makes them human. It makes the situation human rather than it being sort of great big numbers and people that you don't
they're not presented as human in the Hungarian media by the Hungarian government. They're essentially being treated like a plague, like a sickness, like a disease. One recent Hungarian minister of the Reformed Church referred to them as locusts and flies. And the assumption is that they're either there to steal your job or to blow you up. And there's nothing in between.
Dehumanising language, things like locusts and flies, that's what you call it if you want to, and you want to make people not seem like they're human anymore.
Well, they've got a referendum coming up in Hungary in quite soon, actually, a couple of weeks' time. And the government is riding very, very strongly on the anti-refugee, anti-migrant ticket and the information they're putting out. And the kind of questions which are in a referendum are so extraordinarily leading that nobody could answer no to them.
It's terrible. We all know here how difficult a referendum is from our recent experience in the UK when people were very surprised and shocked by the result of our recent referendum experience and whether people, whatever people's opinions were and however they voted, nobody can deny the amount of shock there was in the country and the fallout of that. Something that the British politics and British voters haven't really been quite aware of, that possibility of being shocked by their own by their votes and by a referendum.
Well, I think a lot of us still are shocked.
Yeah.
There are people who are, I mean, we feel relatively powerless. You know, all you can do is to state what the problems seem to be and then do what you can in terms of lobbying people. But we feel really quite helpless. I know there are websites which are dedicated to this. There's one called 48% where people go all the time. It's like, I mean, it's a great thing to have, although I kind of feel I don't want to keep feeding it. I want something to be done.
Yeah, I don't want to be stuck in that referendum and that day and that decision and that thing because I think the shock also shows that it wasn't like a stable decision, if you know what I mean, afterwards. For me, that's how I see it. So I don't want to be stuck on that day. I'd like to move forward.
It wasn't very clear. I mean, the terms of it were completely unclear when it came out. I mean, everybody thought it was binding, and then it turns out it was kind of advisory, but because everybody has believed it was binding, it does turn out to be binding because you can't just tell people, oh, by the way, this was not supposed to be that, it's supposed to be something else. But it was a moment in political life, in political history. And now we've got the movements which are to come. Yeah,
we have to all decide what to do, and I think support the young people who are the people who are going to be really taking this on further. Well,
I think this march today is not distinct from it. I mean, it's the same thing because it's one of the issues. I was one of the people campaigning on the doorstep and asking people, what are you going to do? And there were three basic reasons for voting to get out. One was it used to be better, whatever it was. Secondly, because nobody will tell us what to do, as though people were constantly telling you what to do. And the third was to control the borders. That's to say, stop people coming in. And I think Britain has a few issues with that.
Yeah, we won't go very deep into that. But I think what I relate to in what you're saying particularly is this feeling of helplessness that people have. And I can only compare that with the feelings of helplessness as well that migration probably bring, because you're having to change an environment for another, and that must really challenge your identity. And when you think about it, I mean, I don't know, it's something that really stimulates reflection, and something I think that really stimulates the invention of your personal self.
Well, you've never really had to ask the question very hard before, but you do begin to ask it more because you're confronted with it directly. I mean, this happened very much to my parents. It happened to myself. I think my life there would have been very different to this one. Their lives, they're the ones who chose to come, and nobody chased them out. Nor did they ever regret it. I mean, they always thought they had made the right decision in most respects. But it does mean kind of reorientation, partly of what you understand to be your social position. I don't mean in a hierarchy, but how you get on with your neighbours, what you talk about, what range of emotions are publicly available, and what you keep in, what you express. There's an awful lot of... I've written quite a lot around this, actually, about the idea of assimilation, or just simply getting used to being somewhere. Do you become part of this other society which you've entered? In what way are you a part of? Is there a part of it of which you're a part? And you never quite work it out, really.
No, I mean, I think humans never quite work themselves out anyway, but it's a constant process of reflection on ourselves. And I think even people who haven't been through this process can see it in a metaphorical way in terms of their own journeys, because we all have our own crossings that we take on in life.
My parents told me when we came here that English people are ladies and gentlemen, and that you should open and you should open a door for ladies. So when I attended my first primary school, there's quite a dear old lady there called Kate Reddish, Miss Reddish, for whom I opened the door when she came, and the rest of the class, they laughed, and they thought, you crawler. So then I stopped opening the door, and then poor Miss Reddish was a bit upset because I'd stopped doing this. I was the only person opening the door. When I first went off to art school, you went to art school as well. So I actually went and that kind of partly. I shook hands with people, and people would say, and they kind of do it. But it's I mean, some of it is, I think, it's like a perfectly acceptable game, and it's quite nice.
Well, I think as the generations change, because habits change quick in the West, like fashion really is such a quick turnaround with communication, what's acceptable 1 minute and what's not, what's acceptable the next in terms of fashion, that you can actually cross from certain manners and a way of being quite quickly into another world.
Well, you come into a less direct world than you left. I mean, I think everybody says this. It is a bit of a cliche, but I mean, people here tend to be tactful and to talk this way and a little bit that way generally. That's how we found it. I mean,
I'm from the north, so it's the
it's
so I have the same.
You. Well, we came into London. I mean, we were penniless. We literally had nothing.
Yes.
We were given everything that we had over here. So we started with right at the very bottom. But even then, you just get used to the fact that conversation has slightly different rules. And that was relatively easy if you're young, because I just quickly adapted. For my parents, it was harder. And for my mother, she never completely managed it, although she was a big outgoing personality.
Yes, it is very different for different generations. And do you have any work on that? I mean, you're a poet, obviously, and that's how I know you. And that's how many people know you, George, as an award-winning,
there's
acclaimed
poet. There's a poem
poet.
which I wrote some time ago now called Preston North End. When I was so I came here when I was just about 8. Maybe the next year or sometime over the next, in 1958, maybe. My dad took me to Spurs. And because Spurs were playing Preston North End, and he wanted to see Tom Finney, who was one of the great post-war footballers. And we went down there, and you enter. I'd never been to. I'd been to Hungarian matches, but it's quite different. So you come to this quite big place, and you watch the noise, and you see the heraldic colours, and everybody around you is acting in kind of cohesion, and you're thinking, well, am I part of this cohesion. So there's this poem called Preston North End, and it kind of partly describes what it is, just what it's like watching that. And then how you begin to identify. I was a United supporter, Manchester United supporter. I fell in love with them after Munich. So the poem mentions some of their names. Oh, one thing it's worth mentioning is a thing called a Tebbit test. Does it mean anything to anybody nowadays?
What, get on your bike? Is that
No,
not
that's
it?
not the test. The normal Tebbit test for whether you're properly patriotic was that if you're a Pakistani and England are playing Pakistan at cricket, do you cheer for England or Pakistan? And the test was that you cheer for England.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, there you are.
okay.
That's how
Yeah,
it was.
well,
So, do you want the point?
yes.
Okay. Preston North End. Tottenham Hotspur versus Preston North End. Finney's last season, my first. And my dad with me. How surprisingly well we blend with these others. Then the English had the advantage, but today we feel their fury, sadness and pity. There were some bad years in between, a lot of down-at-heel meandering. For me, though, the deep blue of Preston was ravishment, of a more genteel, poetic kind. They were thrashed 5-1, it's true, and Finney was crocked by Mackay. Preston went down, hardly to rise again. But something got through about Finney, the plumber, Lancashire, the Crown, and those new days are coming. The crowd dissolves, but we are off the crowd, heading into town under sodium streetlights. This year, Wolves will win the title, then Burnley. I will see Charlton, Law, and George Best. The world revolves around them, and those voices on TV reading the results. I'm being bedded in. To what kind of soil remains a mystery, but I sense it in my marrow, like a thin drift of salt blown off the strand. I am an Englishman, wanting England to win. I pass the Tebbit test. I am Anna Lamb, Greg Rosetsky, Viv Anderson, the boy from the corner shop, Solskjaer and Jaap Stam. I feel no sense of distance when a tannoy plays Jerusalem, Rule Britannia, or the national anthem. I know King Priam. I have lived in Troy. Alan Lamb, all these players, they were all foreign, but they all played for England.
Yeah, I mean, football, even though it is also a place that generates conflict and racism, is associated with some of the sport. It's also a very unifying team type of activity in which working class people in particular, working class guys, can get on and play in a team with people from different parts of the world.
I'm a season ticket holder at Norwich City, sitting in the terraces every 2 weeks.
No, that's good. That's a brilliant poem. I really like that. My dad would like that. He's a Man United fan, but he was born in Stratford, so, you know.
Well, that's how it is with Manchester United. I was born in Budapest, but there you are.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually was going to share something, if I can find it, from my own little book, which is The Wire's 2012, which is about Reuters news stories from 2012.
Some of it is on the web, isn't it?
Yeah. And the reason is because I was just responding to that idea, which I find very interesting, and I think it's very telling about how things are different for generations when they relocate. Because normally you think it's more difficult for the older generation because they're the one going to a new country. But in South Sudan and the Sudanese border, when that was drawn, things were a little different because a lot of people had settled in Khartoum from different places in South Sudan, and which is a very very diverse country, lots of different ethnicities, lots of different languages in South Sudan. Daughter dances for camera. I chop tomatoes into blue plastic bowl. It's a good sharp knife. It won't be easy for my children, born and brought up in Khartoum, to go back with me to southern Sudan. It's just a simple little extract, but it's from watching a little video of a woman reflecting on the fact that they were just waiting for them being relocated and people having to go back to their villages, and it was okay for her, the mother in this instance, because she knew the language and everything. Her children, obviously, going to have a real cultural jolt when they went back.
Well, places change. I mean, I was having a conversation about this the other day. with a Palestinian poet. And I was telling him actually about a young Iraqi guy who came here at the age of 3, and his father had all kinds of romantic ideas as to what it's like back home. And then he went back home, and then his father was arrested. And it wasn't like you. So you have, you're removed from your first source, which is fairly common in contemporary life anyway. But you have some ideas about it, and you think if you go back, you will discover that which you left, but you don't.
Yeah, because it's been frozen as well for you in your mind, and you fed that timer which is frozen with the colours of imagination, and there's been no change, and while everybody back home has just been living there.
Well, I think at the time that you're living here, you're chiefly aware of its pains and sorrows. When you go away, you kind of begin to look at its nicer side, and you begin to remember almost alone its nicer side. So you hope a great deal from it. I'm home. Home is the place where you go and they have to take you in.
I think it's good that the human mind tends to dwell on nice things sometimes. Though. It's a very
yes, it is.
Redemptive feature of our brains.
Yes. Yeah, I go back to Hungary most years.
Do you have? In fact, I was reading your blog. I really was enjoying it. It's you've been writing your blog for quite some time, and recently you've been talking about going back to Hungary. You've been talking about your mother, and that's where I got the idea for the title for our show this week, Migration and Invention, because you talked about having to reinvent the character of your mother, but not reinvent spuriously, reinvent in an effort to run down the truth or pinpoint the truth, whatever that is, but the effort is in that direction.
I tend to think that most memory, any memory, is half invention. These little YouTube clips, we fit everything else around them. And there's so much you don't know anyway. So there's stuff you know and there's stuff you don't know. And I think invention, providing you're honest that you're inventing it, you tell people that, look, this is invention. I think people accept that. You notice what happens when people tell you the same story about their lives. It keeps changing, yes? They try to make the story better and better and better, yes? And it kind of separates out from the real events. And I think that happens to us all the time. I mean, my mother died very early. She was only 51, 1975, so a long time ago. And she was a very troubled person in many respects, a bit crazy in some respects. And after all this time, I wrote quite a lot about her then, soon after she died. But now I think I would understand her slightly differently.
Yeah, we change as we get older. Hopefully we have a few more references that we can bring into play and thoughts, reflections. There's a line in Philip Larkin about photographs of you being smaller and clearer as the years go by. I don't know whether it's clearer. It's different, and you hope it's clearer. I think just if you like, trying to invent with love, trying to invent with a certain degree of tenderness. Maybe the passage you're thinking about is she was in a concentration camp, the second one in Penning, and she was rescued from the Americans, and there's a piece of film made by the American forces. It's only about 2.5 minutes long. It shows the time when they're being relieved, and she's in a sick bay, but I don't see her in the film, but I see what the others are like in a sick bay and their conditions. And what all I'm inventing there is I'm trying to imagine what it is like to be utterly wretched and lice-ridden and full of the most awful things, and then suddenly people come up and you've hardly eaten it, they lift you up and they carry you and you're put into a clean bed and there's light and they give you proper food. And you think, well, surely that's imaginable. So I can't say exactly that's how it happened to her, but it must have happened to her, something like that. And simply the act of imagining, I think, can make you feel closer to somebody. Yes. Yeah. I think that's very powerful. And I think we can reach out and touch by filling memory or trying to think of the textures and the smells and the physical immediacy of the sensations that people must have had when they, or not must have had, but yeah,
But you know, there's a
sensations of
sort of
things.
biography in which people say they must have thought this, they must have thought that,
Yeah,
they must have felt it. I
bad
really
language.
don't like it. I don't
Yeah,
like it.
no, I didn't
No.
mean to use that
No,
language.
no,
I had
no,
to
no,
stop
no.
myself.
But that's, I'm
Yeah.
consciously trying not to do that.
Mm.
I don't say they must have done this. I'm saying
Yeah.
I'm making this up.
Exactly, which is
yeah.
much better. But to celebrate the effort, I think it's a brilliant effort that the mind does to try and recreate the idea in the imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's your mother, and so you've got all the personal emotions in that. But it's difficult for any of us to look back at that time. I think with the Holocaust and the holding camps, the concentration camps, the movement, the enforced movement of people. We struggle with it all the time. How we're going to look at it and deal with it, and it's something that we must keep doing, even though it's it might feel uncomfortable and difficult. And you were talking about the young Germans as well that we're showing you around there.
Yeah, that's right. Who are young, they're in their 40s, but to me that's young. I'm
yeah.
67. So I was very impressed with them. And the one who did most of the work, I'm still very much in touch with him. We were sat down to have dinner, and I asked, or Clarissa, my wife, asked him, so why are you doing this? Gathering all this information. And his answer was, I'm ashamed of what my grandparents did. And I said to that, I would not particularly want you to feel shame. You have no cause to feel shame. What I think is valuable in what you do, and this is what we can do, it's not so much going over the terrible details, the horror stories of what happened. We kind of know them. It's to think of the people who were in there as having lives before, having lives after. That in a way you restore them to life by imagining them as alive, rather than simply seeing them as terrible victims having a dreadful, dreadful time for months, maybe a year, because very few people survive more than a year. So rather than dwell on the horror film, think what's around it.
And I think it's important to be able to take the children as well and the new generations as they come on, not to forget people and not to forget. We want to remember what happened, but as you say, not dwell on the detail necessarily. But it's important to archive it so that the children can come up and see this information. They can read bits of diaries, and new people who haven't been exposed to the details of the story before can make up their own minds and re-engage with it themselves. I always hate it when everything gets sort of taught at you, but in actual fact, I think the Holocaust memorials are actually some ways they can be good for not doing that, because they present some
I fully agree they should
of
be remembered, and I fully agree it should be recorded, and I fully agree with all of that. The longest poem I wrote back in about mid-80s was a poem called Metro, which is essentially about the removal of my mother from Budapest to Ravensbrück, which is a camp she went to. The poem stops at the gates of Ravensbrück. I didn't feel I had a right to enter. I think it's good to know what happened. You have to record it, because that's part of the honesty of the whole thing. But I would feel awkward about some vicarious horror. I think you have to admit, yes, it was there and it was terrible. And if you want to know, we have the record. We got everything perfectly listed, what happened on each day, to whom, when, in what way. But then I would like you to think about people who are not entirely defined by that, to whom this happened, although it wasn't the only thing that happened, because, my mother 20 years before, and she had another 30 years after.
Yeah, and also I think with some of the archive material, I'm an archivist, so I often think about things like this. It's important to protect it as well from misuse, because we want to be able to go in and see an educational, in the right way, or in a good way, with a good mind. But you don't want things to be misused. If you didn't protect for instance, particularly film archiving, which I worked in, if Holocaust movies were used in adverts or something, you can imagine how awful it would be.
Well, it can be. That's a long debate. It's very interesting. That piece of film, when I was in Germany, I gave 2 talks on the same day, one to a school, all the older kids in a school, and one to the town. And in both of those, they showed the film that I first found on YouTube, as you do. I found it about 2007. Same film, about 2.5 minutes. One difference is that in the version that they showed, there was a commentary. So this, and my one didn't have the commentary, it was just raw footage, and with the odd bit of writing every so often. And what happens when you put a commentary on it? It becomes a kind of a more coherent whole. But you also become a little bit wary of it. People have been struggling with this subject for a very, very long time. I mean, and writers particularly. And yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting film, Son of Saul. Did you see that?
No, I haven't seen that.
No, it's a very, very dark film to watch because it's entirely subjective, and it tries to be as honest about things as it can.
Yeah, I know that the British soldiers who were doing the liberation of the camps, when they went in and they took their film, they decided on the aesthetic of having the slow pan around the camps. They didn't know how to film it. I mean, they were just ordinary people who just were taking news footage and were documenting things as they went, and they weren't prepared for the horror when they went into the camps, and they had to decide on a way to film it that was respectful and just sort of make it up as they went along in terms of aesthetic and format. And
I think there's aesthetic in everything, even the original American Forces film, just basically taken to record. They still had to cut it into some sort of pattern. They had to decide, do I show more of this close-up? Do I now cut to somewhere else? I think that's natural. I think the human mind is always looking to make shapes and meanings. So I think that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think we just sometimes have to be aware that that is what we're doing.
Yeah, and I was actually really impressed reading the accounts of it, of the process that the soldier filmmakers had taken, actually, because they had clearly thought about it seriously, and I think that's really important. We have to be very reflective. I don't think we should stop thinking about things.
No, I know. It was a huge shock at the time for, I think, everybody. They didn't realise that it was going to be like that. Maybe after the first Dachau or Belsen, I think it was Belsen where the British were. And I think Jonathan and David Dimbleby's father, Richard Dimbleby, was out there, and he was the British reporter doing this. And the sheer astonishment that people can do this to each other. I mean, on the other hand, people have always been doing this to each other. It's just that it's such systematic, such apparently cold, efficient sort of way of doing it, I think, that struck people.
Yeah, it was shocking. Thank goodness it was shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were looking at further than the shock, obviously, before I dragged us back into that terrifying moment. So you've been looking at the wider lives of people who've and other things in people's lives.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, what happens to them? I mean, the people I know most about are my parents. My father was in forced labour in Ukraine, and, he survived that. That wasn't easy either. Actually, what happened in our case is after my mother died in 1975, my father was completely bereft. And for a couple of years, we went there once a week, and I did 2 hours conversation with him on tape. So I just recorded it as much as I could. And so he became the chief source of my knowledge, both of him and of my mother too, actually. And out of that, you understand one has a special and a weird relationship with one's parents, because you grow up with them, but you know nothing about them as adults, really. You just get the parent bit. And then you spend a long time freeing yourself of that. And then you go back and you kind of see them as people, and you begin to reconstruct bits and pieces that were all out of shape. And I think that's the important thing about us, that we are having to be this or that thing under this or that condition. But somehow these things add up into some kind of incomplete puzzle. And that puzzle, what happens to people? You know, with the writers and the artists and the filmmakers, you kind of know because they're articulate about it and they make things which are respond to a situation, particularly from the writers, I think. But for most people, it vanishes. It vanishes with them unless you're really asking.
So have you got any poems at this point which might help to illustrate that kind of process? That it's the sort of process that we're talking about a little bit, I think.
Well, what have we got here? I suppose, okay. This is a recent poem called Backspace. You know, when you're on a keyboard and you press backspace, you make things disappear. So it's about disappearing. Backspace. Whatever frozen piece of clear sky goes missing, vanishes, like us. Simply to vanish is intolerable. Sky does not quite vanish. Any erasure is a denial. Blank sky does not deny us. We can't comprehend our vanishing universe, our compact with time. To have been erased from history is to have been detached from time. Something deletes us, presses the backspace. We fall out of existence. It is an offense to memory. It is death without a death list. Let us at least see the list from which our names have been deleted. Let us read ourselves out of the sky as by right. We did once matter. Because we mattered, didn't we? We are matter. We can't have vanished.
That's brilliant. I think it's very telling from the point of time in which we're living in as well, because we're at a time when recordings of people and text about people and photographs about people due to digital media are being... they're just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. As archivists, it's something that people struggle with too. What's worth archiving? What do you keep? What do you not keep? And different times.
There's more information available than ever before. More to hand. We can find out more. We can enter libraries. We can open film archives. We can listen to sound archives. Once I began to research the book about my mother, I found sound archives where people in similar situations were talking about what happened to them. Lots of written down evidence. Archival places collect all these things. They don't pretend to make a coherent whole out of them, but that's not their task. The task is simply to say, if you want to look, you'll find something here. You won't find everything, but you find a little bit. And these guys in Germany who've been so helpful to me keep sending me more information, such as like who actually lived in a particular building, what age were they, what were their names, which of them survived, which of them didn't. And a little bit, it's like reanimating a piece of paper sculpture and turning it into flesh.
And it's fixing it back in time as well, isn't it? That's the thing. When you look back in the past, things aren't changing all the time. They change, but you have this illusion that you're making something still, but things are never
nothing
still.
holds still. What that poem is about everybody vanishes. That's just what happens. Whole planets vanish. But we feel odd about vanishing.
Yeah.
And we don't want to have vanished entirely.
And we lose people in our heads as well, because we forget.
Yeah, yes, we do. And I feel bad about forgetting people. You feel bad about just forgetting people's names. And then you think, I used to know whatever happened to them. And should I have written to them? Are they still alive? All of that. And we hate bits missing from life. And we live in a sort of world, I think, or at least I sometimes did, that you will go down a street in a foreign city and you will meet practically everybody you hadn't met for a very long time.
That's like something that's supposed to happen to you just before you die, isn't it? isn't it? I had a dream once about all my ex-boyfriends. Oh, in a room. It's so awful.
Bad city.
Yeah, that wasn't very nice. But yeah, there's such a burden on ourselves to try and cram our minds and keep everything alive, because it's so impossible for, this idea that our heads should be full of everything that we have seen and been, and all the people that we were, either in our family history or in our actual lives that we've met.
Well, you can't, I think, but you can be aware that they are potentially exist. And I think this sort of ties up this whole business that we've been talking about people wanting to come in, people wanting to stop people coming in, people stuck on borders, people without anything, people who have no immediate prospective future, or people who had futures and lost them. We don't have to know everything about them. We just have to know enough to recognize their likeness to us a little bit, that these guys who were living at this address in Budapest in 1944, there's an old guy there, 75, I can practically smell him. All I really know, I kind of, because I've seen other old guys in old flats in Budapest, and I think tobacco, and I think everything else, cheap tobacco, I've got him there, and he sort of comes alive a bit. I think the problem is when we just block each other out.
Yes, I think so. And I also think we have to sort of trust the good side of ourselves. I don't think we should try and control our personal self through our consciousness, or not consciousness, is that the word? No, the conscience is very important, but the control, and that, trying to control and make, more names, more lists, more, try and keep a grab on it, because I think if you trust the good side of yourself, you don't have to have everything held.
No.
Sort
Sometimes
of free.
people get confused as to which is their good side.
That's true, yeah.
I think very few people go into life thinking, I'm really bad.
Yeah, but you can take...
I love making bad decisions.
You can take people into yourself without having them as a kind of consciousness knowing. That's right, the kind of knowingness to the forehand. You can kind of have a beingness of sort of assimilating people that you've met and places you've been
I know it's a weird thing. I sometimes find myself talking as though I knew people, and I sometimes think, but I don't know anybody really. Everybody's just weird. Everybody's strange.
Especially me. or you.
Well, very pleased to meet you. But I think, one assumes a great deal. And one has to assume because there's no alternative. So you have to go by the little bits that you know. But I think if one can transfer, I don't want to sound at all preachy about this. I hate being preachy. Just a little bit of kind of understanding of ourselves onto the understandings of others. Those people lost in whatever situation they are in, and not entirely block them out. I think it's a step in developing some kind of sympathy with them.
Yeah, and I think also doing is really important. Isn't it? What we do is incredibly important, as well as what we know.
Yeah, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. You've got to do something. Sometimes it's difficult for people to know what to do. I go at least to part of this march today, and I think I'm probably doing a good thing. I'm swelling the numbers by one. It's good. I feel encouraged by seeing the people there, to seeing their numbers. I assume they feel encouraged by seeing that there are considerable numbers, and that gives us a bit more courage to do something else. Yeah.
And you can see each other's faces, which is great. You can look at each other's eyes, hopefully, if you can see.
I like the people's faces. It's very interesting. Back in about 1989, I've spent most of the year in Hungary, and the guy who ran the country before had died. But also because everything was blowing up in terms of politics, everything was changing. There was also a formal reburial of the guy they had executed in 1958. And there were two different groups of people going, there's two different things on the same day. And a friend of mine said, I love those faces there. And It's projection, sure. It's partly projection. But it's, it's moving. I think there is, you kind of see the humanity. You don't see too much hardness.
Yeah, I think looking is really important as
Yeah.
a thing to do. Learn to look, or not learn to look. You can all look. Just go and look. Peep faces and.
It's encouraging, I think. But it's encouragement not just for us individuals. It's encouraging for all the others, even those who see everybody else. And I think, we're not alone in this. And we think it's a good thing to be doing. As I said, no doubt there'll be people who believe exactly the opposite, who also think they're doing a good thing. But we make these choices.
Well, you do. And I think that it's always good to be open. I guess that's a choice maybe I've made. But I was try and be open rather than sort of fixed in.
It's a project. I mean, it's hard, and I think as time goes on, in some ways it gets harder. To return to poetry for a second, back in 2008, Blood X published this thumping great 500-page book, which was my new and collected work, and I thought, so that's it, so that's me. That's what I've been doing for, I don't know, God knows, decades. What shall I do now? And in some ways, it was a very liberating moment.
Yeah.
I thought, I can do anything. Because those people who like what I do, well, like or not, but those people don't think you're up to much anyway. Well, that's your life's work up to then. They haven't think much of it. So and it was very releasing. So in some ways you can become, I think, more open to all kinds of things once the pressures have sort of declined. The pressures have been released a little.
So once you've proven yourself, you've gone through the new and collected or whatever. But
all you do is you see that you have done a batch of stuff. And that people have recognized that you've done a batch of stuff, and it's in a book, which is when you first start writing, you say, "Oh, I wish I'd write a book. Oh, I'll never publish a book." And then you do, and you think, "Oh, I bet the second book won't be as good as the first book." And so you go on and you go on. So you're never ever satisfied. And then you come to this thing where you think, "Oh, 500 pages of stuff," and then you think, "Well, it exists. If nothing else, it exists. Here's work that's been done." And then you feel I've done a certain thing in a certain way. There's nothing wrong with the way I did it. If I can do it in that way again, but it doesn't mean I have to do it. You can be slightly different. And I think it's an old age thing in a way, and I'm 67. I don't feel old. I feel like the usual sort of guy. I feel about my late 40s or something like that. But I know, really, I'm not. My body knows I'm not. So you think, well, so what is this rest of your life? Well, what are you going to do with it? Because I'm retired from teaching. What does it add up to? Are you just simply tailing off? So I'm saying, no, I'm going to mess around. I'm going to just splash around in what I love doing. And it doesn't matter. That book's there. It's in the bank. God knows what it's worth, but it's there. And the rest of the time, if I want to mess around with writing stuff on Twitter, which I do quite a bit, or if I want to write funny poems or just concentrate on writing poems that don't even look like poems, then why not do it?
Have you got anything recent and playful to illustrate your gay and, and carefree later?
Oh, let me see, what is there? I haven't brought anything terribly light along that way.
No, we didn't really set such a light theme, I guess.
No. Well, I'll tell you what, it's a light little thing. It's only about 5 lines long. Nope, 6 lines. There's a famous poem by Auden called Musée des Beaux-Arts, which begins about suffering. They were never wrong, the old masters. And it's looking to picture about Bruegel. And this just takes that first line, just messes around with it, okay? After a line of W.H. Auden. About suffering, the old bastards were very seldom wrong, turning our flesh to dust so we might turn that dust to song. Their own songs being the kind to which we were obliged to sing along. it's fun, you see. I wouldn't ever... I don't take it seriously, but I loved doing it.
And I think on that note, George, I should go over to the piano, which has been rigged up actually for the Hello Goodbye show. And we're hoping it is going to still sound. So I thought I might just tinkle away and just do a bit of piano improvisation. And then you can just read or say anything you want at the same time. Yeah. So we'll just finish with, something a bit free and easy.
Look forward to it.
Thank you, George Szirtes. And
such a pleasure.
I'm going over to the piano now.
Right.
So you're listening to Resonance 104. The piano that Jude is about to play was kindly supplied by Marks and Pianos Limited.
Yes.
A Carol for the Road. A carol for the road. The child on a dirt path finds the highway blocked. The dogs at the entrance snarl that doors are locked. The great God of kindness has his kindness mocked. May those who travel light find shelter on the flight. May Bethlehem give rest to them. The sea is a graveyard. The beach is dry bones. The child at the station is pelted with stones. The cop stands impassive. The ambulance drones. May those who travel light find shelter on the flight. May Bethlehem give rest to them. We sleep, then awaken. We rest on the way. Our sleep might be troubled, but hope is our day. We move on forever like children astray. May those who travel light find shelter on the flight. May Bethlehem give rest to them. We move on forever. Our feet leave no mark. You won't hear our voices once we're in the dark. But here is our fire, this child is our spark. May those who travel light find shelter on the flight. May Bethlehem give rest to them. My father carries me across a field. My father carries me across a field. It's night and there are trenches filled with snow, thick mud. We're careful to remain concealed from something frightening I don't yet know. And then I walk, and there is space between the four of us. We go where we have to go. Did I dream it all, this ghostly scene? The 100-acre wood where the owl blinked and the ass spoke, where I am cozy and clean in bed, but we are floating, our arms linked over the landscape. My father moves ahead of me, like some strange, almost extinct species, and I follow him in dread across the field towards my own extinction.
Thank you.
Okay. Cheers.
Terrible cold, I'm so sorry.
Resonance. This is Resonance. This program has been brought to you by Resonance 104.4 FM. If you liked what you heard and want to support our work, please make a donation at fundraiser.resonance.fm.